Okay, welcome everybody to this Learning Analytics Learning Network session. I'm Simon Buckingham Shum at the UTS Connected Intelligence Center here in Sydney. I'll just let Shibani and Ming briefly introduce themselves in a moment. I'm a professor of learning informatics. I come from a human-computer interaction background, and I've been leading this project on writing analytics for the last 5 years here at UTS. Shibani.
Hi everyone, I'm Shibani and I'm a lecturer here at UTS from the Faculty of Transdisciplinary Innovation. And I was a PhD student before earlier at the Connected Intelligence Center where I was working on writing analytics and automated feedback on writing. So I'm currently a researcher and a lecturer here. Great. And I research on learning analytics, writing analytics, more specifically on automated feedback and how it's integrated in classroom contexts.
All right, Ming.
Hello everyone, my name is Ming. I'm from Southwest University, Chongqing, China. I'm focused on the automated feedback generation and how it integrates into classrooms. So before I joined the SWU, I was a postdoctoral research fellow at the Connected Intelligence Center, working on the writing analytics.
Great, thanks very much. Okay, hopefully you can all see my screen now. And here's the order of the day then. I'll be giving an introduction to writing analytics, and there'll be an activity for you, which will involve jumping into a Google Doc and doing some annotation. We'll be introducing AcaWriter, which is the web application we've been developing, and explaining how it picks up rhetorical moves. We'll talk about the importance of combining writing analytics with learning design, and how that helps us integrate it into the student experience and teaching practice. We'll be talking about some of the research findings that we have about the kinds of impact and reception this has with educators and students, and talking about how we co-design this with educators to build trust in this kind of AI technology. It's quite novel. We'll take a break at the hour, and then we'll be diving into what we call the AcaWriter feedback prototype, which is a Jupyter notebook, which allows you to see a little bit under the bonnet, but don't worry, you don't really have to be a coder if you're not coming from a technical background. And we'll conclude by talking about where we think we're going next and asking you, well, what do you think you'd like to do with this, and open it up for discussion. So there'll be the chance to ask questions and share any thoughts as we sort of transition from these different sections. Feel free to put things in the chat, and we will pick those up during the session. If it's something important, we'll try and spot that and answer it immediately if it's just a confusion or a clarification that you want. Otherwise, save your questions for when we have the breaks between these different sections. Okay. All right. So without further ado, I'm going to dive into the first section then. So by writing analytics, we're going to refer to that as analyzing written texts. Perhaps we should have said, you know, through the use of computational means, because people have been studying texts for a long time manually, because we want to understand writing processes and products. And that's a researcher perspective, okay? We've got new tools available for researchers to study this phenomenon of how people write and what they produce. But critically, learning analytics is more than just a set of power tools for researchers. It gives us the ability to close that feedback loop in real time back to the writer. And we're going to be talking about the provision of formative feedback. that could be giving insights to educators about how their students are going, but specifically to students. Okay, we're not going to be talking about automated grading. That's certainly part of the space, but we're really focused here on feedback to help students understand their writing and how they can improve it, as opposed to, can we calculate the grade score that's sufficiently close to what a human would give you, but often with very little rationale as to how you could improve it or how we got there, because the machine calculates grades very differently from a human. Okay. Shibani can put the link to these slides into the chat. Actually, we forgot to share that, so you can grab these slides. We'll share those with you, and you can follow links.
Yes, we do have them on the chat, Simon.
That's great. Okay, so just for example, if you wanted to be a researcher studying what students have written, you might be using a very powerful tool called Cometrics, which has got a whole set of metrics for cohesion. Developed by Danielle McNamara and her team at Arizona State University. And it's a powerful tool for analyzing what is the structure, what are the characteristics and properties of the text. We're not going to go into a lot of detail, we're just making you aware of some of these kinds of tools. Measures of cohesion, you can see all those different measures in the table here. We might be studying writing processes. For example, these are very, very fine-grained analysis of what the researcher did. They typed, sorry, what the student typed in. The first I, then they hit the backspace, time I met him was, and then there's a pause, and then a backspace, I thought, and there's another pause. So very, very fine-grained keystroke analysis of how somebody was writing. And that's a whole research field in its own right about what that might tell us about a student's competency or cognitive load and so forth. Here's a different example from colleagues at Sydney University, looking at a sort of visual analytic of how a document was revised as they moved through time. Okay, and here's another example from our own work. Shibani had developed an automated way of what she called revision graphs, where we look at a sentence and we look to see what changed as we move from, in this case, from through drafts, or in this case, looking between the difference between two texts. Again, you can read all about that in these links at the bottom. Okay, so these are tools for researchers, which of course might end up powering a tool for an educator or a student. This is an example of a tool called WritingPal from the Arizona State University team, which is now a product. Mainly for high school students, this is targeting, and you can see they have a little avatar that gives them tips about what to do. They have feedback, which gives them an indication of their grade in this case, and some explanation of how they can improve. Turnitin, who we know mainly as the people who will check for plagiarism, but they also moved into the formative feedback space. This is their tool, Revision Assistant, which is using machine learning to pick up on different kinds of properties. And again, you can see they've highlighted a sentence here, and there's a little tip appearing. And they're also inviting you to tell whether you found that helpful or not, which of course will feed back into the machine learning. This is a tool called Scribo from a Sydney-based company called Literatu. Very strong presence in schools and moving into higher education as well. And you can see the kinds of things they're looking at here. Again, annotating the text directly where they think that they can see that happening. And they've got a very nice set of teacher dashboards, which allows the teacher to show examples to the whole class and to give feedback on sets of texts and so forth. So definitely check that out if you're interested. It's quite a polished product. Okay, Now, before we go any further talking about our own particular platform, we're going to invite you to do a little bit of analysis yourself. So guess what? You are an intelligent agent, we hope. And we're going to ask you to do a little bit of text classification just to get your heads into this. So a student has drafted a research abstract and they need some feedback. And we're going to ask you to highlight the key sentences in this Google Doc. Shibani, you can perhaps, or Ming, paste that link into the chat and highlight those sentences and add a comment in the margin as to why this helps make the abstract effective. Okay, you're trying to give positive feedback on really good sentences that made that an effective abstract. And then we'll give you 5 minutes to do that. And then 5 minutes, you can paste your paragraph into the shared document on this second link and see what did other people come up with. Okay, so jump in. I'm just going to pause the recording and we'll let you have a little work on that. Okay. Okay, so we're not going to spend a lot of time looking at that, but you can take a look at that shared document later on. But what we are going to show you in a moment is how our AcaWriter tool made sense of that paragraph, just so that you've had the chance to think about that. Okay, so any thoughts or questions that anybody's got right now before we dive into AcaWriter? We all good? Okay. All right, so we've been developing this as a web application to teach the hallmark rhetorical moves in academic writing, which is, you know, a pervasive problem across all disciplines as far as we can make out, which is why it had strategic importance for us. We've been developing this and it's now actually been released to the whole university. And we have a web portal which introduces the whole approach to staff and students. And we've released it open source. So if you're curious to know more about it and want to play with it, you can get it up and running in your own environment, inside your own firewall. That's one of the ambitions we have for this platform, is that it might facilitate collaboration around writing analytics research and the improvement of the tool. And there is an R&D program that sort of underpinned the whole thing, which you can see at that link there with the kinds of references that we're going to be referring to. Moving from a research prototype to a product is a significant step. It takes a lot of technical infrastructure work that many research projects don't really bother getting to because you know, they're not planning on deploying it 24/7. But what we have been doing is getting all of that stuff in place and now starting to run training with the academics and the tutors to teach them how to integrate it into their teaching practice. The full application I'm just about to show you now, but there is also a public demo version, which is a very stripped down version. It doesn't have all the functionality, but it allows you to experiment with it later on. So I'm just going to share my my web browser with the application now, just so you can take a look at it. Okay, hopefully you're seeing that. Yep. Okay, so when you're a member of the university here, and you log in using single sign-on, this is what you see. The students might have been given an assignment code, which they type in, and it takes them straight to the correct part of the system, the correct genre of writing, and so forth. Or you can create a new document here, and you can see there are 4 genres of writing, and you choose the kind of writing you're doing once you've understood what they do. Give the document a name and make the document. This is the sort of list of documents that looks, you know, just like Google Docs. There's a list of all your documents. And if I open up the research example that we just gave you, I pasted in the text here. Okay, this is just a text editor. I clicked get feedback, and we are in the research abstract genre, which means that it gives me feedback on a particular set of important categories of sentence. For example, a background context move is highlighted here in the sort of pinky peach color. In blue, it's talking about a research problem or an issue or a gap. In green are this sort of signposting, in this article we're going to do this, or we show XYZ. And you can see that these sentences here actually weren't highlighted at all. Now, of course, that doesn't mean they're not important sentences for the abstract, but they're essentially assertions. They're assertions that the authors are making, but they're not articulating their stance towards those assertions. They're just asserting them, okay? And what AcaWriter is looking for are the kinds of statements like has been a focus for research for many years. In the resources tab, you can see it provides clues as to what these different tags mean and the kinds of linguistic constructions that students need to learn to use when they're making their thinking visible. Okay. And on the feedback tab here, you can see it gives positive feedback. It also suggests you haven't done something. Now, AcaWriter is not perfect by any means, and this warning at the top tries to make sure that the students are aware that the agency is with them, the responsibility is with them, and if they want to defend their writing and they think AcaWriter got it wrong, then that's okay as well. So this is why, because it's so complex, we're not doing grading here. We're just trying to make sure they understand what do we mean by these things. And in this genre, you can also show the underlying sentence types that underpin this color-coded categorization. Okay, so under examples, the student gets to see a lot of different examples. You know, what does it look like for a law essay? You'll be hearing more about that in a moment from Shibani, or accounting. And this has been tuned to the particular kinds of writing. This is a business analysis report by accounting students. And the tips here that the educator has put in are quite specific to that writing task and the assessment rubric. Okay. As an academic, you also get an interface for creating an assignment and giving it a description, and then it generates the unique code that you need. Okay. So back to the slides. That's a little glimpse of AcaWriter, and you'll be able to play with that far more later on. We've written a whole bunch of resources for students and teachers around this. There is a 1-hour interactive tutorial, for example, on how to write an abstract with interactive exercises. It introduces the different kinds of moves that are important in an abstract, carries those throughs into AcaWriter. Something to note that if you enroll on this course, it's free for an hour, then you get access to the full version, in fact. So that's a little incentive for you there. And this comes from the PhD work of Sophie Abel, who is one of the students here in the Connected Intelligence Center. Okay, now what exactly is going on here? What is AcaWriter looking for? So we're focusing on rhetorical moves. And that is a discoursal or rhetorical unit that performs a coherent communicative function in written or spoken discourse, according to Swales, whose work we're building on here. So in brief, you're signaling to the reader your stance in relation to the sentence. You're making your thinking visible. Am I summarizing prior research? Am I expressing surprise? Am I claiming novelty? Am I claiming that there's a problem or a tension of some sort here? The status of that sentence in the writing is very, very important. Okay, and here are some of those examples which you got a little glimpse of in the tips tab. Okay, and for those of us in academia, these are all very, very familiar. But what we have here is essentially the sort of a taxonomy, a classification scheme that provides some language to help us talk to students about what these moves are doing. Okay. And, you know, especially if you want to become a researcher, until you know how to make those moves, you can't really communicate to the reviewer or your readers what your core contribution is. Here's the interface that we saw earlier. So I've just captured those things that I showed you. The feedback and the resources. If we think about a completely different kind of writing, we also deal with reflective writing, which is first person, reflecting often on an experience of some sort, like a work placement. Unlike a lot of third person analytical academic writing, we want you to talk about thoughts and feelings. Don't normally do that when you're writing an essay. We want you to talk about what you're finding difficult or how you think you're changing. We want you to talk about how you might do things differently in the future. We know that students and teachers actually find reflective writing hard to teach and hard to learn. People don't really know what's being asked of them. And we know that they vary widely in the depth of writing that they may engage in. So from a research perspective, we have distilled a lot of the scholarship in this field into a conceptual model. You can see in these cells some of the questions which sort of map to the intersections. Okay, now that's a conceptual model, but we don't necessarily want to present all of that to the students in a writing user interface. So we introduce a visual language which talks about context, challenge, and change, and introduces these icons. And that encapsulates a lot of complexity that we don't necessarily want to expose to the students. And that generates a user interface that looks much more like this, where you can see it's written in the first person. We've got these different icons here. We're also using typography to capture that depth dimension. And you can see the feedback here is completely different from the kind of feedback you would give on an essay. Okay, and we have been evaluating this with students as well, just as we have with the more analytical kinds of writing. Okay, now just looking under the bonnet, we're using what we call a concept mapping approach. It's a set of rules for detecting the rhetorical moves. And we're using some open source code that was developed by colleagues in France. It performs a whole lot of natural language processing to recognize sentences, identify the parts of speech, syntactic dependencies, but then critically these salient sentences, as we call them. The analytical parser, which is the sort of third person research writing, essay, argumentative kinds of writing, has got these 8 categories of sentence. The reflective parser has a different set of categories. And what Ming and I have been doing more recently is still in the labs, but is starting to develop a machine learning approach as well. So just to make you aware that the current tool is really using this rule-based concept matching, but we have machine learning coming through, both for classifying abstract sentences as well as depth of reflection. There are certain kinds of concepts that we are looking for. We're looking for things to do with thinking and experiencing. What we call mental operations, or having a stance, an affective or feeling kind of stance to something. Talking about time, the past or the future, and certain kinds of relationships which are around causality or explanations. Contrast, very, very important in academic writing, of course, talking about problems, unexpected things happening, gaps in our knowledge, authors disagreeing with each other, very important. And then change. Okay, now associated with each of these is a lexicon. So when we recognize one of these categories, then there's we do that by seeing certain you know, lexical expressions which we map into these categories. But what we're looking for are the combinations of these in a sentence in any order. So very quickly, there's our ontology, okay? And if we had something like, I do not feel as though I've sufficiently developed my practical knowledge or phronesis to a point where I can speak up and challenge my manager, that's a piece of reflective writing. And we are looking for the presence of, as you can see highlighted over here, we're seeing certain concepts occurring in syntactic dependencies in that sentence. Or again, staying with the reflective writing example, in the future, it would be beneficial for me to sit with them and take notes, etc., etc. Again, we're picking up on talking about time. We're talking about feelings or affect, the yellow here, as this word has been classified as something to do with causality. So the point is that there are many ways of saying something, and this deeper level allows us to get at that. So in this paper, for example, if you go talk to an academic and say, how do you recognize good reflective writing? They would say, well, one thing they do is they talk about how they're changing as a learner, as a professional. This is the kind of thing an academic would say. And I would recognize that because I would see expressions of this sort, okay? So we say, okay, we're going to call that a shift in perception. And in terms of the classifier, we want to see an author kind of expression, I, me, my. We want to see something to do with mental constructs, knowledge, understand, attitude, and we want to see language to talk about change. And these can occur in many different ways, but they're all examples of what we're going to call a shift in perception. Okay, we're not going to go into any more detail on that, but there are some quite detailed webinars that introduce the training for this. Okay. So I'm going to pause there, probably gone on too long already, but are there any quick thoughts or questions about that which people want to ask before we move on? And we'll allow, you can unmute yourself if you want to just stick your hand up and ask a question.
Yeah, there's a question on the chat, but I'm wondering if you want to ask that question. So basically the question is about machine learning and why we are now working on machine learning solution. And if there is any evidence that the rules are not operating well, what's the reasoning behind moving towards the machine learning?
Yeah. Ming, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, we are currently evaluating the performance of the rule-based and machine learning-based approach. Yeah, it shows machine learning approach perform better, than the rule-based. So that's why we're working. Yeah.
So rule-based approaches are always going to have limitations. I mean, the advantage is you don't need a vast corpus to generate those rules. You just need a very smart linguist who's going to analyze representative samples and find patterns that perform well. But they're always going to be brittle as well. And the machine learning approach is going to take a completely different approach to classifying. And in fact, we can use the output from the rule-based concept matching as input for machine learning as well. Okay. I couldn't see the chat, so I'm just scrolling back now to see whether there are any other major questions. Doesn't look like it at the moment. Okay. All right, let's move on then. Shibani.
So are you able to see my screen okay?
Yep.
So thanks, Simon, for introducing AcaWriter. So in this next section, what we're going to say is basically how we integrate that into classroom context, because what we see in our work is it's quite important to make it, to take that to the learner, to the educators, to actually make them useful in real classroom context, for learners to take it up, to use the tool for improving their writing, because that is the end goal of the work that we are doing with these sort of tools in education. So we talk about this conceptual model that we came up with from our work to integrate AcaWriter and similar learning analytics tools in real classroom context. So it's called the Contextualizable Learning Analytics Design, because we think the context is quite important in learning analytics tools. And we talk about how we can make this integration easier. So the key components here are the learning analytics components, which are in orange, which are the features and the feedback and UI. And we also have the learning design components, which are the assessment and task design. So as you know, the learning design is quite important because that sets the foundation for how learners perceive these tools. And the key here is this, the first component here is assessment, which we know is important because learners need to relate it back to what they're being assessed. Educators also need to make sure that the tool is relevant to what they are teaching in class and it aligns to their curriculum for constructive alignment, which is why the educators come in as part of this learning design. And we also have a task design component where there are writing activities that are designed, co-designed with educators, make sure that they are pedagogically salient along with the tools that we are using. So the students are inducted well into the usage of this tool and make sure they have proper orientation towards using it for their own learning. And the features that we come across are the features from the data that are important to show to that learner. We make sure that is aligned quite well with the assessment, again, to make sure that they fit in really well and they're aligning with each other. The feedback and UI, again, we tune this particularly to a particular writing context to make sure that it is relevant again. So all of these components, we represent them as gears because we want these gears to work synchronously with each other. We don't want them to be pulling in opposite directions and have a disjointed view there where they don't work together. So we want the technology and the pedagogy working hand in hand. And there's quite a lot of detail about that in the paper if you'd like to see, but we'll go through these elements with the examples from AcaWriter. So, so the first context that I would like to just give you as an example is a law writing context. So here it's from a university where students are, undergraduate law students are writing essays, and they're quite argumentative in nature. And writing is a key disciplinary skill for lawyers, and they learn to do it with writing these different essays. And they need to discuss an assigned topic. They have to clearly outline what arguments, they need to back it up with cases or past background literature. And the instructor had designed a rubric which was looking for certain elements in a typical law essay, what they consider a good essay to be. So for instance, they were looking for things like engagement with the law and scholarly literature, and that is part of their assessment. And we were able to map it to AcaWriter's feature, which is a background move, which is looking for past prior work done by someone, and it picks it up as a background move. So we were able to map that with the rubric. And again, the educator was looking for things like a statement of thesis, where they clearly say what the essay is about, introduce the purpose of the essay, and come up with a plan saying what the essay will talk about, and these could be mapped to the summary move in AcaWriter. And similarly, they were looking for critical analysis or insights and emphasis of ideas, which we were able to map it to contrast and emphasis moves. So you can see that there is this alignment happening between the assessment and the features from the tool. And we also tune the feedback and contextualize it for that particular law essay context. So you can see the key moves here are highlighted in those different colors and highlights. And the feedback is again tuned for that context. So the feedback messages here are co-designed with the educator. So we sit with them along with designers and researchers. The educators say, this is the kind of feedback that I want to give to my student if they miss a background move. So it says, it looks like you're missing a background move, and gives them more examples and gives them suggestions to improve. So again, this is very specific to that kind of law essay. And there are also a number of writing tasks. So there's a design of pedagogic activities that go along with this tool. They are introduced on rhetorical moves, because for a lot of them, that term is quite new. They would not have heard of that before. So we need to tell them what that rhetorical moves means, why is it important for them in the law context. And the educator helps clarify these things, giving more examples from their own context. And they do also a number of activities like matching those rhetorical structures to their rubrics, so they get a better understanding of the alignment. And then they work with some examples, so exemplars, viewing how a revision can be made to make it better, to make the structure of writing better. And then they also engage in some assessment tasks where they're asked to think about what grade they would give if they were to mark that essay, for example, putting on the shoes of a marker. And also students are asked to revise that text using AcaWriter feedback or without AcaWriter feedback, but and getting into that process of revision and drafting and redrafting so that they are good with writing processes. Again, they're also engaged with peer discussion and feedback, and discussing what feedback means in those contexts, what revisions they can do. They'll also do feedback surveys at the end for us to evaluate how it works. And towards the end, they also get a guide to use it further in their own writing. So this whole intervention designs are carefully designed with the educator so that students understand what's happening behind those tools and use them effectively in their own context. And in many of our earlier studies, so this has happened over many years, like Simon said, we've also had control conditions where some students get feedback, some students don't get AcaWriter feedback, so we can study and evaluate how the feedback is useful. So this is an example from the law context where we've run this over many semesters. And just to give you another example, so this is from the accounting context where students are writing business reports. So as you know, this is a completely different genre of writing. So they are not argumentative of any sort, but they're looking for key things. Again, the instructor is looking for things like providing a perspective of a company and providing an emphasis or critical insights. And these, again, could be mapped to AcaWriter's rhetorical moves. So in this context, the feedback is tuned for that particular business report. So the students get relevant feedback. And similarly, they have some writing tasks which go over a number of weeks here. They do some online homework, then they do some in-class activities, then they use AcaWriter on their own draft reports, and they submit their reports for assessment, and so on. So these are just some examples to show you basically how AcaWriter and the activities surrounding that are tuned for specific context so that it is relevant for that context and the learners appreciate it because it makes sense for them to use it in their writing. And there are also a few other examples, like Simon mentioned. There's a research abstract module where students have another set of orienting activities and feedback tuned. There's also reflective writing, which are personal accounts. And all of these are tuned for specific contexts. So I'll just pause here for a minute to see if there are any questions before we go on to more findings from there. If anyone has questions on this so far, you could probably unmute yourselves.
I would like to ask a question. Just in terms of how long should a piece of text be for your tool to provide something that's meaningful?
Yeah, so it usually takes text from different sizes. And the example texts here are not very long. They're about 5 paragraphs. It also takes longer text. It just takes a while for it to process and give it back to the feedback as feedback to the learner.
No, I'm more on the other side of the spectrum. If it's really, really short, if it's a sentence or 2 sentences.
Right. It can still give feedback, but it will probably depend on what's in that sentence. Maybe if it doesn't find anything very peculiar in the sentence, it won't give it. But there's no minimum limit. In fact, you can just put 2 sentences in. You might still be able to get it if there is a rhetorical move that is salient, and AcaWriter has found it.
So at present, it works at the level of the sentence. So you could literally put 1 sentence in, and as long as it recognizes it as a sentence, then it'll give you feedback on it. All right. That is also a limitation because we know that meaning is not chunked into individual sentence units. And that's another reason for machine learning to provide judgments at a much more holistic level. Okay, there don't seem to be any other questions unless anybody else wants to jump in. So keep on going, Shibani, thanks.
Yeah, sure. All right, so I'll go through some of the research findings because I think they are quite important to evaluate if it's working or not and what we see and observe from the interventions that we run with students. So we have different measures of impact. We have things like perceived usefulness score, which is basically just a satisfaction score of from surveys that we run, feedback surveys where students rate them in terms of how useful it was for improving their writing. So like at scales of from 5 to 1, if it's very useful or it's not useful at all. And we have also, the results are actually from some earlier from late semesters, where we compare the differences from students who get AcaWriter feedback and who don't get any feedback. And there's a significantly higher rating from students who get to use AcaWriter feedback on how useful it was to improve their writing. And with the later iterations from accounting, we also see almost 66% or more students selecting the highest rating in terms of usefulness to improve their writing. So they agree that it's quite useful for them to get used to the tool and the intervention to use their writing. And the numbers are here. And all of these, all the statistics and the detailed reports are reported in a key article, which reviews 5 years of R&D and the different measures. And again, another measure is the student feedback itself. We get qualitative survey responses from students on how useful they thought it would be. And here are some from Law. I'll just pause for a minute for you to read this. So here the student says, when you're editing your own writing, you automatically think your work sounds good and your ideas have all been conveyed. And the exercise was useful because it indicated areas where I needed to be more explicit, which I wouldn't have noticed on my own. And here a student says that they find it quite useful that to find a new tool which goes beyond grammar and spelling mistakes to give feedback on the structure. Here's another student who's saying it's like having a tutor or another person check and give constructive feedback on your work. And we also have done detailed interviews with educators who were involved in using those tools in their classrooms, and details of their different challenges, their motivations, how they implemented it, and what impact they found is all reported in, again, a detailed paper. But here are some key quotes from them. So an instructor telling that they noticed it changed and they noticed their essays were better and they will be better lawyers for it. And here's another feedback saying that they get a lot of positive feedback from students because it is automated and they can get this feedback anytime because the lecturers don't have enough time. So they usually have to deal with students in large cohorts. They have 400 to 600 students. They wouldn't have time to give personalized individual feedback to all students, and the tool can help them do it at any time of the day. So they find that really valuable. And apart from that, survey responses, we also look at actual writing improvements done by students. So we look at their original essay that we gave them. We look at the revisions that they made to the essay and see if they have improved because of the feedback that AcaWriter gave. And here's a sample here, which is comparing the scores of revised essays by students. And you can see that students who used AcaWriter feedback in this control group, they scored higher for their improved essays when compared to students who did not get any feedback. And we also saw the number of rhetorical moves in the essay was significantly higher in the students who used AcaWriter feedback. And this is in accounting, where we saw students who used AcaWriter's feedback and completed the online tutorial, which was optional for them. They scored a bit higher than students who did not complete it in their final writing essays. So we also see actual improvements in student writing, along with the survey about how useful they thought it would be. Another impact is also looking at the revision process, which is how engaged they are with the feedback and if they are making revisions. So Simon talked about these revision graphs earlier. So we can actually see the kind of changes that students are making. So this is at a sentence level. So you can see here towards the left, here students have not done many changes. They've just done minor changes. And here over the light, here many sentences have been changed and a number of rhetorical moves have been introduced by this particular student. And we can also study the processes which are happening. So one student here has requested feedback so many times, like more than 8-9 times, and they have been making changes continuously to the draft based on the feedback. Whereas on this end, there's also another student who has probably requested for feedback, but is not making any changes much. So we can actually study to that level of what kind of feedback provides what kind of improvements and what revisions are students making. So those are different measures of impact that we study. And again, these are all coming from that context of law, accounting, but there are evaluations being done in all sorts of contexts we talked about, including revision abstracts, research abstracts, and so on. I'll pause here again for any questions, then we'll go for a break.
Yeah, Shibani, there's a couple of people interested in the ethics approval process for this, because it sounded like we decided not to give any feedback to certain students. Can you just talk about how we managed to do this in an ethical way?
Sure. So like I said, this whole intervention ran for many years. So when we first started this intervention and the design, what we didn't have was any idea of whether the tool was effective or not, what kind of feedback it would give, whether students would find it useful. So in a way, there are two things. One is first of all, we don't know if it's effective or not. So once we see there is a significant difference, then we start giving the tool option to everyone because we know that it's useful. But the first instance, we don't know how effective it was. And also the way the intervention is designed is whether or not you get the automated feedback, you still get value out of the whole writing process because there are a number of tasks which scaffold students to get better at writing. So things like working with exemplars, doing self-assessment, having a peer discussion, and all of these tasks are embedded with or without feedback. The students would still find the writing intervention useful for improving their writing. And for students who get automated feedback, it's an additional support that they get. So it was framed in that way. And then once we ran it 2 or 3 times and we saw significant differences, we stopped the control conditions and then we started offering the tool for everyone.
That emphasizes the importance of really good learning design, which is a safety net in case the technology breaks or isn't being helpful. It's still a constructive, productive activity for students to be doing. It's part of their program. Okay. Very quickly, Shibani, somebody was asking, what did the circles mean in those revision graphs? Can you just flick back there?
Sure, I know it went quite
Yeah.
fast.
I mean, there is a paper you can read about this, but very quickly, each circle represents
a sentence. So each circle here represents a sentence, and this is the original paragraph which was given, say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So there are 12 sentences in that original essay that we gave to the students, and then they did some revisions and brought it down to like 11 sentences. And the edges are basically the changes that they are making. So if it's a light edge, which is yellow, it means they haven't done any changes to the revision, to the sentence. It's exactly the same. And these are based on the changes that they're making. If they're making very slight changes, it's a high similarity, which means it has a teal color. And then if they have not done many changes, it's in a different color. And again, with these revision graphs, which are multi-stage, so these are called multi-stage. Here again, it's the same concept of how one sentence is kind of transforms into another and what changes students are making at a sentence level.
Yeah. Okay. And there is code that generates these.
Yes, so this code to generate the automated feedback revision graph is actually available open source on my GitHub page. And so you can read more about this in the paper.
Okay. All right. So final section before we take a break, handing over to Ming.
Okay, so you have heard about the writing analytics tool, which Simon has introduced. They can automatically detect the sentence which belongs to one of the categories of rhetorical moves we have defined. And how we actually to integrate this tool into classroom, and Shibani has explained this well, so we can design a good writing activities in order to make use of this tool. Now, I'm going to introduce another way is by using co-design AcaWriter feedback. So co-design gives voice and influence to educators and help ensure the usefulness and the usability of learning analytics tool in real-world context. So, and the following slides will present some examples of co-design AcaWriter feedback, writing rubrics, task-specific prompts with the educators. So the first example is co-design AcaWriter feedback message. Here shows an example of co-design reflective writing feedback for pharmacy students. In this case, so the educators and I sitting in front of two large computer screens work out the feedback templates. A shared Google Doc for filling out the feedback was displayed on the left screen, while the AcaWriter feedback was displayed on the right. So in order to create useful feedback from educators for their students, we adopted a replay enactment approach, which use authentic student writing data and a writing analytics tool, in this case, AcaWriter, to prototype a feedback creation experience for educators. During the co-design feedback process, so the Google Doc, here we just highlight, was used to record the patterns and the feedback message. So we have explained the AcaWriter output and asked educators what should be said to their students, whether this reflect these features like context, challenge, or changes appeared or were missing. So this allows each stakeholders to have a clear role. Educators use their domain knowledge to write the feedback message on Google Doc. For example, what if you see the context appeared in the student writing? What's a positive feedback message you are going to want to say to your students? So the educator just write down the for the feedback message here. So the learning analytics team, which you include me, myself, wrote down and developed the patterns, in the shared Google Doc. And you will say, when the time goes by, the patterns becomes more complex. It's not just simply this context appears. So sometimes if the context doesn't appear, but the change element appeared, and what's, message you are going to talk to your students. So the educator can give a more specific message based on the combination of the appearance of the reflective elements has been detected. So by this way, which keep each stakeholder's power balanced and promoted deep involvement of the co-designs. So in the hands-on exercise, you will have the opportunity to use a Jupyter notebook to modify the feedback message, or you can even add new pattern matching rules to create AcaWriter type feedback message. So as a result, we have developed 4 common patterns and implemented in the system for creating feedback message. And finally, the feedback tab was added into the system. So we transform the feedback templates and give this to our developers, and the developer implement the patterns, and then also the feedback message. So now you can see a feedback tab that was missing, but after the co-design process, so we create a specific feedback for their for different class based on their feedback message developed. So Shibani has also explained the CLAD model, which mentioned earlier. This model emphasized on the writing analytics model, and rubrics, task, and feedback should be aligned together. And in fact, each one can shape the others through co-designs. So the left part of the slides present 1 examples of how to co-design the rubrics for reflective essay writing about teamwork for business students. We have explained the reflection model, which also Simon mentioned earlier. This is a reflection model we have based to develop the reflective writing analytics tools. And we explain this, okay, so we have these several categories the system can detect, and then how you're gonna to the element, and then the educators can modify the rubrics, modify the assessment items, which can map to some of these categories which the analytics tool can offer. And the right part illustrates another examples of how to co-design the task-specific prompts for business accounting report, and also based on the analytics model we can developed. Okay, so I think now we can move to the hands-on activities. Before we jump to that, is there any questions?
Any questions about that co-design aspect? It's certainly been one that's helped accelerate the design of the feedback, and it gives the educators the power to actually literally shape the code, because they can draft the kinds of things they want to see. In another example, in the blog post, we were setting the threshold for determining whether a sentence should be classified as emotionally strong. That was the example on the right there. You can read more about that. So they are really having a very influential voice in the way that this system is going to behave. And that only seems appropriate because it's their students that they're going to put in front of this.
So Simon, it's Stuart. In undergrad writing, it's very common to see more personalized writing. So if they're doing something like an argumentative essay, then you could put in feedback messages that would say that this type of writing was basically inappropriate in some way for that genre. If they're using personal, you know, I
yes.
think, that kind of things.
Yes, because that's not a form of expression that we want to see in that kind of writing. Similarly, many academics aren't so interested in seeing the students citing sources when they're reflecting on their work experience, and some are. So, you know, there might be aspect of the analytical parser that's brought in, or the academic might say, I'm not interested in that, that doesn't matter. I just want to see how they're making sense of their own professional learning. I don't want to see them making arguments in relation to the literature. Other academics do want to see that in reflective writing. Well, we've been talking at you for an hour now, and more than that. So we thought we'd just give you 5 minutes. We've got a bit of padding at the end of the whole plan that would allow for a bit of slippage in the schedule. Why don't you take 5 minutes, and then we're going to bring you back and talk about how we move from textual features, which is the language of machines, to feedback, which is what we want to talk about with teachers and students. So we'll just pause the recording there. Okay, we're back, and Shibani and Ming are going to walk you through a Jupyter notebook now, and explain a little bit about what's going on under the hood, so to speak.
Yeah, so so the purpose of this notebook is basically to demonstrate the design process that happens when the pedagogy and the analytics come together. So we use these kind of notebooks as artifacts where educators and analytics people can talk to each other and understand what's under the hood of these computational technologies, what kind of feedback that can they design if they want to give it to their students. So it's basically to kind of map the social infrastructure, which is the learning need, the task, what the students need, with the technical infrastructure, which is the computational capacity. So in the notebook, you'll basically see chunks of text and code. So it is a Google Colab notebook. So if you're not familiar with running these kind of notebooks, they're great ways of interacting with code if you want to. So if you're technically oriented, you want to understand what the code is doing, it's written in Python, so you can go and change stuff there, change highlights, or if you don't want to, that's also perfectly fine, because you can just go through the steps and ask any questions if you have, and change the writing, test with different forms of writing, and suggest what kinds of feedback we can give. So, so the text field is just static, so it's basically just displaying information there. But there are small blocks of chunks of code. So if you look at the code blocks, if you scroll down a little bit below Ming, there are code blocks like this, which come with a play button. So you can look at there. If you click on that button, it will basically run the code there and produce the output for you. So you should all be able to get a copy of this particular notebook from file. You can copy to your own drive for later if you want to play with it. It's basically a prototype of what AcaWriter does. So instead of having a tool, we're basically letting you develop your own AcaWriter feedback tool using the APIs and the technical infrastructure that is built there. And you might have to connect to the runtime allocation. So that next to the editing bar, there is a small memory allocation. So if you're doing it for the first time, you might have to connect it. And the different commands are basically in the tools. There's a command prompt to understand what prompts you can do. But Ming is probably going to walk through these different steps to see what each block is doing. How do we map it from those low-level features, which are basically what the computer gives us, to high-level features. Say the learning task requires the student to use certain author names in a particular essay. What kind of features can we pick up at a computational level? So we can use kind of named entities to recognize names of people, and then we can write some code to generate feedback if they miss certain names. So we are basically doing that bridging of the computational methods and the feedback generation to the learner. And I'll pass it on to Ming to go through this notebook along with you all.
Thanks, Shibani. Okay, let's have some fun with the Jupyter notebook. So basically, we call this is AcaWriter feedback prototyping tool, and this tool can actually to use AcaWriter API to pass the text automatically, get the classification result of the text you pass it to the AcaWriter writers. So as we mentioned earlier before, AcaWriter can detect two types of writing. One is reflective, another is analytical writings. And for each one, we can detect different categories of the text. Based on the detection, we get a list of the detected categories. We can write rules, say if the feature A appeared, you can give a message for this. If this feature A appear before B, and you can give another different message. So we have implemented 4 types of functions which can detect the patterns of the writings. And you can actually use these functions in your writing. So in order to use that, the first thing is, of course, is to input our text, right? Your student writings. So in this example, you just execute the cell, and it's just pop up a box, HTML box, and you can use this example text, or you can use your student writing text and copy and paste. So in this case, this is a reflective writing text. And the second part of the code is more about use AcaWriter APIs. So we send the request, HTTP request, and then pass the essay value, which is the text box, and then you get the result as a JSON object automatically. And what this JSON object contains, this contains the list of sentence and also the corresponding categories to each sentence. So the category, as we mentioned, this is the rhetorical moves, which has been classified. So the next section is about how to, we just add some to visualization. So as a result, after you execute this cell, you can, as a result, you can show it shows the rhetorical moves. Most like the AcaWriter interface, but it's not the real AcaWriter interface. So it's this is prototype. So it shows first the definition of each category, and the second part is some of the sentence has been automatically highlighted, detected by the AcaWriter and highlighted. So you can use different colors to indicate this, and to indicate different categories, sentence categories. So this case is challenge, deep reflection, change, self-critique. So the rule-based approach we develop right now, current use, is one sentence can belongs to multiple categories. So don't be surprised if you find one sentence belongs to context and challenges. This is a common phenomenon. So the next cell is to, this one we still is not feedback, right? It's more like a report. So we just, some of the sentence, the key sentence has been highlighted. So in this case, the key reflective elements has been highlighted. The next part is actually to how to transform this analysis of the features into actionable feedback. Right? So this is part, as I said, when we can co-design this with educators to say, if the message appear, like context appear, you can give, what you want to say to your students. And so you can give a positive feedback. And what if this is missing? Context is missing, so else context is missing. You can give a suggestion, a cautionary feedback. But if the context is missing, but the changes appeared in the document, you may give a different feedback. Okay, so you can change this rule. This is quite flexible, and you can, depends on your subject. You can think about, and you can change the message, also changes the patterns. So after you execute this part, so you can end up with these messages. So I think if you are familiar with Jupyter Notebook, I strongly encourage you to implement some new functions, to capture the patterns. If you're not a big fan of the Jupyter Notebook, you may just change the message based on your subject. Yeah, I think that's it. Any questions?
Okay, thanks, Ming. So, yeah, questions about that? Tanya, what happens with the rules and the feedback that teachers define? Well, once we have prototyped in this environment, which of course is not a very user-friendly interface, but we're there to facilitate the sense making and the interpretation with the teachers, then we go implement it in the proper web application, which is all the examples we showed you earlier of AcaWriter. Feel free to jump in again, Tanya, if you have questions about that. Yep, so this is a rapid prototyping environment, which allows us to try and get the messaging right, get the conditions right, and then we hand it over to the programmer. So just to reiterate, the idea is that, if you grab a copy of this following that link we put there, you can run each of those boxes that Ming was stepping through. You can paste some text in, then you can fiddle with the messages that come back or the conditions and just see how it works. It's a sandpit for you to experiment with a piece of text that perhaps is from one of your own students or perhaps one of your own research abstracts, and see what happens when you just change the different parameters, because these parameters are all ones that can be modified. Yeah, Tanya, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, in the demo, you mentioned the API. Is the API available outside of this?
Well, we're making the dev API available to you to experiment from this Jupyter Notebook, but we're not throwing open the API forever to the world because we can't handle that. So we'll leave this API open for you for a little bit, but if you want to keep experimenting, then get back to us. And as I said, this is all available for you to install in your own infrastructure, where you can experiment to your heart's content and throw PhD thesis at it and see how long it takes and so forth. And of course, if you did actually want to deploy this, then you would want to have your student texts and everything stored in your own intranet, etc. And but we'll talk in the final section about where we think we might go with this as well, and we welcome your thoughts on that.
And there's also an AcaWriter demo that you can use, which has a nice UI, and you can just put in different types of writing and select a particular genre and see what feedback it comes up with as a UI tool. I've just popped that link in the chat.
Okay. Well, any more thoughts or questions about this? This particular section where we've shown you what's going on under the hood, so to speak. Okay. Not at the moment. Okay, in that case, maybe what we'll do is we'll just sort of move to wrap up and then throw it open for a wider conversation. Okay. So this is the kind of roadmap we've got thinking about the future. You know, we've now released this to all of our students, and we're interested to see what their adoption patterns are. Up till now, we've shown you how we work closely with academics to integrate the experience into their teaching practice. But we're also now just made it available for those students who are interested to try it out. And we're not sure whether that's going to work or whether it really must be embedded in a good learning design. Now, anecdotally, you know, I have reports of students coming back to me saying that was really useful. It helped me. But it's too early to be able to make a big claim about ad hoc self-initiated use of AcaWriter on its own. So we'll see how that goes. We're now running these workshops that build educator capacity. This is an example of that, but to all of you out there, but you know, within UTS, we have a regular opportunity for academics to come and see what's now possible, to see whether that leads to further conversations. We're dreaming of a user interface that would allow the learners to give feedback on the feedback. You saw a little example of that in the Turnitin revision assistant interface, where there was a comment in the margin, and the student was asked, was this helpful or not helpful? That would give us a little clue. But what we have done with pen and paper, Shibani, in her research, helped students to engage more deeply with AcaWriter's feedback by asking them to generate the PDF. You might have seen that PDF button on the interface. That prints out something that you can then print, and then you get your pen and your highlighter out, and we want the students to go through and say whether they agree or disagree with what AcaWriter said, and whether they think there were any false negatives. Do they think they had an awesome sentence there that they expected to see highlighted? So that deeper engagement actually led to stronger findings with the students on their on the ultimate impact of AcaWriter. Another way of thinking about that is a paradigm that our colleague here, Kirsty Kitter, has called active learning squared, where we don't only have machine learning going on and student learning, but we have student learning going on as well by critiquing the machine's classifications. So we wrote a paper that was in LAC 18 called Embracing Imperfection in Learning Analytics, which is an approach to saying, look, we want to use analytics and AI for these quite high order complex competencies. It's almost guaranteed the machine's going to get it wrong. It's just very, very hard to model some of these 21st century competencies adequately enough that the machine is always going to get it right. But that's potentially a teaching opportunity. That's a learning opportunity if the learning design encourages students to critique the machine's feedback and teaching the machine, in a sense, what's right and what's wrong, and defending their work and engaging mindfully with AI feedback as a way of actually developing a lifelong learning competency and developing a healthy skepticism of machine intelligence as well. So depending on what your learning objectives are with your students, it might actually be more than simply write a better competitor analysis in your business studies or write a better law essay. And the academics we've been working with have welcomed instilling that disposition into their students as well. For example, machine learning, text analysis, that is just going to be part of your working life in the future. Well, here's the chance to engage with some right here, right now about your own writing. And we want you to think deeply about what's working and what's not working, which of course should help you think about your own writing and what you're doing well or badly. As I mentioned, we're moving into machine learning. Ming has been training a classifier on abstracts. which we think could complement the existing rule-based concept matching classifier for abstracts that we've shown you. And also for reflective writing, the depth of reflective writing. And we're hoping to have some research papers that document the effectiveness of that shortly. And finally, you know, this is a more open invitation to all of you to think about whether this is a platform that might help you advance your own teaching and learning or research or both, but also to collaborate around it. So for example, you know, the gleam in my eye is that other groups of people trying to teach engineers to reflect professionally might be sharing data, suitably de-identified, or sharing the models that they build, sharing code, of course, as an open source platform. So that, you know, we have limited capacity here at UTS. It's out there. This is scope for new PhDs. You can build this into your own research bids. And, you know, there's scope to really move this forward as an open source enterprise, as opposed to being at the mercy of whatever the companies are offering us. Not that that's all bad by any means, right? But there's no way you can change the behavior of those systems easily. And there's no way you can do completely new things that isn't on their roadmap. So the advantages of an open source research-based consortium is something to think about. And finally, we're offering the little baby demo interface for you to try things out, but we are getting interest in a hosted solution, which doesn't require you to install stuff in your own infrastructure. And we're happy to hear any interest about that as we try and sort of gauge whether that's something we could move into. Okay, that's all we wanted to say at this point, and we really welcome your thoughts and reactions on that. And if you're interested, there is also a special interest group on writing analytics as part of SOLAR. Happy to hear your thoughts now. So I'll just stop sharing and we can go into gallery mode, and feel free just to feed back to us. We're really interested to know what you made of that, whether there's some things bugging you about this, you know, writing feedback, machines understanding writing is controversial. Some of you may be feeling quite skeptical about this, so we're happy to hear your thoughts. Okay. Kirsten, do you want to ask your question, or do you want me to read it out for you?
No, I can ask it because I'm in Switzerland, so students writing theses and essays in English, of course, but when they are writing English as a second or as a foreign language. So what would I have to take care of if I would like to use this system, but for students writing English as a second or foreign language?
It's English only at the moment, I'm afraid, but that could be where machine learning really comes into its own. You would have to basically, if you wanted to use the rule-based concept matching, you would have to basically build a new lexicon, and then it could work, but that would take some time. You know, a new lexicon. I mean, the rhetorical moves wouldn't change, but there would need to be a new lexicon which would map expressions in the writing to those different kinds of concepts.
Yeah, that would tackle my other questions when I write in another language. My first question actually was when I'm not a native writer, but my English is I'm writing in English as a second or third language. Is this system suitable? The feedback, the rules, is it suitable for a non-native English writer?
Oh yeah, yes. Yeah. In that case, yes. I mean, we have so many international students here writing in English as a second language, and if the writing is, you know, grammatical, and we can parse it as a sentence with grammar and syntax and dependencies, then no problem. It does cope with, you know, imperfect English, but if the English is really bad, we actually have something in there which says we really suggest you do a spelling and grammar check first before you're really going to get the most out of this tool, right? So yeah, that's the short answer. Shibani, did you want to jump on that?
No, I wanted to just say that because we did test it with some other students here. We have international students, like Simon said, who don't have English as their first language. And so they have been using the tool. It works as long as the sentence is structured in a way that the tool can read that it is a sentence. And the words are appropriately used. But you can actually try out the tool to see samples if you have, to see what kind of things it picks up from the particular samples that you see from your own students.
Yeah.
But generally it does work with English, even if it's from someone from second language.
Mm-hmm. Okay,
Yeah.
thanks.
All right, Ali, did you want to jump in?
Yes, thank you for this great presentation. I'm a PhD student from University of Queensland. I'm working on learning analytics, and most of our works are around, my work are around peer evaluation, where a student is going to evaluate the quality of resource created by their peers. So what we understand is that if we consider just the subjective ratings, like a 5-scale Likert questionnaire, a student usually overrate the quality. But in our platform, they have the option to provide some comments, some short comments or explanation of their feedback. When we consider the quality of these comments, the result would change. Like if we just consider even the simple length of the comment, the quality of the peer evaluation would be increased dramatically. Like their answer, their rating is much more similar to experts' rating. But I add some similar, more advanced NLP tools, like some tools to find the relatedness of the comment to the actual question. You know, mostly a student provides some naive comments like good, interesting, not good, confusing. But if they elaborate more on that, the quality would change. So my question is, can we use these tools to find more, features? Like, is this comments have some feature like critical thinking, clearness, or correctness of the question, some feature like that.
Mm-hmm.
But in a short text, like not a essay, just something around 200 words.
Well, again, I think the short answer is yes. Shibani, you actually did some work with peer feedback around AcaWriter, just in case you're interested in that combination. We were interested to know whether students got benefits from AcaWriter in conjunction with discussing it with a peer. But that's not exactly what you're asking. You're asking, could you analyze peer feedback using AcaWriter, right? Yeah.
What I realize is that these tools mainly concern about the structure of the writing. But I'm going to find if the text, if the provided text is related to the context. You know what I mean? If it's talking about some technical or even, some more related sentences or topics that discuss the actual learning material.
Right. So you mean, one student has written a report about X. Are they getting feedback which is relevant to X?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
So we have a resource. We have a learning resource. So we have something to check.
Yeah. Shibani, do you want to make some comment on that?
So I just want to say that there are computational features that you can use for doing these sort of things, but things like similarity, understanding how similar they are, and different forms of similarities to see what matches, if it maps with a comment and the discussion. But within AcaWriter, not all of them would be useful because some of them are very specific to academic writing, but there may be a few categories, say from reflective writing or contrast from analytical writing that you may find useful. Certain tags that you might still find useful for analyzing the peer comments, but probably not as a whole because it's been created for a different genre of writing. But there are definitely other computational techniques, and you can even define your own model. So if you have a suitable set of corpuses of peer comments, and if you're able to tag them as good, bad, or what kind of topic or category you want to put that in, you can probably build your own model and deploy it for giving feedback on peer. And I think there is quite some work on this space. There's a tool called SWORD, I guess, Peerceptive.
Yeah.
And I think Diane Littman was here earlier. Her work in Pittsburgh, it's also touched upon this space, which is specifically looking at peer feedback, which you might find useful to look at those resources too.
So,
yeah.
Okay, what we are going to do next is to help a student provide a better feedback, a better quality feedback. So can we use this tool? Like we are going to provide some simple prompts when they are going to submit their feedback, just to announce that this comment seems unrelated to the resource, or this comments may or may not have the critical thinking element. So my main question is that, can we use this tool, like your Aqua tool, to find this?
Yeah, I think you'll have to go back to that design process that we talked about, in the Jupyter Notebook, where we are connecting that analytics to the feedback to the learner. If that particular analytics makes sense, you will have to derive features. It might be from AcaWriter. Some AcaWriter features may be useful. Say there is a contrast feature in AcaWriter that you might find useful. Or there are features about change or reflection that you find from the reflective parser. But yeah, you will have to go through that design process to understand what kind of features can be used to map, to make sure that the feedback is effective for a peer evaluation case. It cannot be directly just pulled in as a tool and put in front, because it needs some contextualization and relevance to your particular context. Hope that answers. And Simon, if you want to add something.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing is, there's a question of whether the feedback is talking or picking up on concepts in the material that's being commented on. But the other important thing is we know quite a lot about how to give good feedback and how not to give feedback, right? Now, we know that many academics are actually not very good at giving feedback, right? So you could say the risks are even higher when you ask students to give each other feedback. So there is a whole field around feedback literacy, which you may be familiar with. I don't know, Dave Bowd, others down in Melbourne and Monash. We just ran a 2-day workshop with them, which I put into the chat, called DAFFE 2020, Designing Automated Feedback for Impact. And that is at the intersection of automated feedback and the question of how does that relate to all we know about raising feedback literacy amongst educators, and what are the opportunities for automated feedback to help build feedback literacy, as well as using what we know about feedback literacy to help design good automated feedback. So I think there's a synergy there where each of them can shape the other. Yes, and Yu La has just put in David Carlos in Hong Kong, another leading thinker on that, working with Dave Bowd and others. Yeah, so yeah. There is a huge opportunity to try and use tools to scaffold. In fact, Dragan Gazovic has talked about could we invent Grammarly for writing good feedback? Or could we, which is another way of saying, could we tune AcaWriter or any other tool to help write good feedback? And the links I put in the chat there to Peerceptive and to Peer Logic are trying to give students feedback on the feedback they're giving.
Yes.
Yeah. So I guess, well, you're doing a PhD in this, so I guess you know all about this, but just for the wider awareness, this is an interesting space to be in. Yeah. Can we capitalize on automated plus human feedback in a sort of synergy?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, folks, look, we have a few minutes left. If anybody had something else they wanted to share.
Simon, I'm Ian from New Zealand, and I just have a question about what you're operationalizing with AcaWriter. I mean, the genre, I'm a text linguist and a genre theorist, and I find what you're doing is particularly interesting. And essentially, as I understand it, it's supervised machine learning, which identifies rhetorical move structures in terms of quite discrete point linguistic elements. And in the examples, I could see it was doing excellent work. What I'm really interested in, as a genre theorist, I'm always concerned with theories of genre that don't operationalize these things in a very comprehensive way. And when you look at those texts, even the ones that you had, they're highly complex thing, and they can be analyzed at all different levels and all different knowledge types. My question is, do you think there's further possibilities for expanding beyond just rhetorical moves, which the AcaWriter is doing at the moment?
Yes, of course, there's potential. You know, nor would we ever claim that what AcaWriter is doing is as rich as what a human genre analyst would do. Of course, you know, it has a very explicit pedagogical intent, which is to teach students these building blocks. And once they become fluent, of course, they may break the rules and be creative and do all sorts of interesting things. But yes, if what I'm hearing you saying is that as in any field where you do computational modeling, you can use that to test your theory, right? You got a theory and you write, can you formalize it enough to demonstrate that it's actually codable? That's essentially what we're doing here. We are taking some genre theory and formalizing it to the point where a machine can do it. And that may be interesting from a theoretical point of view for you, but there's certainly nothing to stop further stretching and challenging of that approach.
No, I mean, when I was looking in the examples, I was seeing things like meta discourse. I was seeing things like, you know, other linguistic features, which, you know, it would be lovely to see them kind of built into the model alongside the other things. But I guess the question, the issue, the theoretical issue or the pedagogic issue is how much information can you load upon a learner from a machine-based tool, and also what's salient. I mean, in some genre, move structures are highly salient, and others like undergraduate essays, they're not salient at all. So, you know, it's a really interesting field. I think it's a very new field, and I think you're doing some excellent work. I don't mean to demean it at all. I'm just interested in further exploring the complexities of all of this.
Yeah. Well, it's just a whole new vista opening up, basically. And what you're talking about is, it's a computational sort of linguistics research project, or it could be turned into a more teaching and learning project, which requires some underlying, you know, linguistics research in order to develop a tool which is practical, robust, and intelligible enough for an untrained educator or student to understand what's going on. And we've tried to communicate here how the underlying complexities need to be hidden behind a user interface that is simple enough for a student to understand what's going on.
For sure.
But the better the research underpinning it, of course, the more useful it's going to be.
Thank you.
Yeah. But thank you for the feedback. It's nice to know that someone who really knows what they're talking about is seeing something promising here.
I think you're doing a great job.
Thank you. All right, so look, folks, we're at 1 p.m. here. It's lunchtime in Sydney. Don't know what time it is with you, but time for us to stop. So I want to say thanks very much. Do get in touch with us if you've got further thoughts. If you have technical people who want to actually get this running in your own institution, reach out to me and we will support them if they're getting stuck. and we look forward to hearing from you about any of the other aspects on the roadmap. Okay, so thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.